As the vote count continues in the opening days of the new Abbott-led government, commentators, politicians and pundits alike are reflecting on the weekend's poll and what brought about such a decisive coalition win. One of the surprises on Saturday night was the Labor Party's results in Western Sydney, managing to hold on to a number of key seats in what they consider their heartland in the face of what many expected to be a wipeout. Similarly surprising were results in Queensland, with the billionaire Clive Palmer grabbing a sizable chunk of the vote with his Palmer United Party, formed just months ago. And joining me now to discuss all this in the studio with me is Michelle Rowland, Labor MP for Greenway in Western Sydney, and Liberal MP for the Queensland seat of Moncrief, Steve Ciobo, in our Brisbane studio. Thanks both for joining me.
Pleasure,
Congratulations to you both. But Michelle, if I can start with you. Now, you had quite the fight of your political life. Everybody, pollsters and pundits, but certainly the pollsters are supposed to have more of a scientific approach to these things. They all had you pretty much written off, and yet you came back and you even managed to swing to yourself.
Yes, well, firstly, can I congratulate Steve on winning his seat as well for what must be, I think, the 5th time, Steve. Congratulations to you on getting return and being a member of an Abbott government. I mean, certainly it was a very humbling result, particularly when you consider, I think my opponent was on $1.10 on the day. Every poll had written Greenway off. I was told, 6:15, you may as well just, go home, and then to really be in a shot quite early on in the night was really a very humbling experience.
In fact, we've just looked at the AEC site and it looks like you've got a 3.1% swing to you in that seat. What do you put it down to? Were you just lucky that you had a hapless Liberal candidate there?
Not at all, and the Liberals expected to win on the day. I had, there were Liberal Party people on the booths handing out how to votes, basically mocking me and asking me if my CV was up to date. Only 2 more hours left in your job, Michelle, that sort of thing, and planning the party, planning who was going to be working in the electorate office of the Liberal members, so they expected to win. And, I actually put it down to 3 years of hard work.
All right, but equally, as we understand from media reports, you also took advantage of the hapless Liberal candidate Jamie Diaz, and you were running a big television screen around the neighbourhood, around polling booths, is that right, with his gaffe, the famous gaffe that he made with the Channel 10 interview?
Well, that was on the day, Helen, but let's remember too, my opponent was very hard to find by your media colleagues and certainly by constituents during the campaign. He didn't turn up to debates, didn't turn up to community forums, so it was very difficult to be able to express and be able to demonstrate that I was the better candidate.
Labor did have a devastating result, as former Prime Minister Bob Hawke put it, but it wasn't the outright bloodbath in Western Sydney that was expected. What do you put that down to? I
think we had very good candidates, very good sitting members.
So it was the effort of those sitting members, would you say, rather than the overall campaign and the leader, Kevin Rudd?
I've no doubt, and all of us really had sort of been in politics in some way or another for quite a while, and I think all of us knew that there was no substitute for hard work. I mean, even in Lindsay, David, that wasn't the wipeout that was expected. And remember in the Penrith by-election, which was just before the 2010 election, there was like a 20% swing and people were predicting similar, and it certainly wasn't that. All
right, why do you think that you had such a decisive loss and the coalition had such a decisive win?
Well, I think I think there were a couple of factors. Firstly, people wanted change. I think that the message about the need to change the government to do different things, I think people had made up their minds on a number of policy issues. I mean, I think there's any number of reasons, but certainly, let's take it for what it is. It was a decisive win, but certainly it wasn't a loss that everyone was expecting.
Steve Ciobo, if I could bring you in here, and congratulations on you retaining your seat. You held on primary vote, but rather surprisingly, you also suffered something like a 6% swing against you. Why do you think that was?
Well, what we saw in Queensland, Helen, and first of all, thank you very much for your congratulations, and I extend my congratulations as well to Michelle. She did stand up against the current, and that's a credit to her. And we obviously didn't have the smoothest campaign in her seat, but in Queensland, Helen, I think what took place were a couple of things. We certainly saw the Palmer Party, and this was especially pronounced on the Sunshine Coast and on the Gold Coast, where there seemed to be a higher level of support for the Palmer Party, that there was a swing from both the Liberals, from the Labor Party and from the Greens. So effectively Palmer seemed to be able to attract support from each of those three parties. How someone from the Greens could vote Greens in one election and then vote Palmer in the next election, I'm not sure, but that notwithstanding, that seems to have been what's taken place.
All right, well, in fact, Clive Palmer got over something like 11% of the vote in Queensland, and his candidate won a 14% swing to him in your seat. Now, he also had a swing against Labor. I mean, doesn't this mean a pox on both your houses, that a lot of people were saying, well, I'm going to give the Clive Palmer party a go?
Oh, look, I don't dispute for a moment that Palmer got, my seat 14%, the seat to my north was 15%, and the seat to my south it was 16%.
They're very big swings, aren't they?
Well, what it clearly was, Helen, was a protest vote. I mean, as I said, he was attracting support from the Greens, attracting support from the Labor Party, and attracting support from the Liberal Party. That's what transpired. And, Clive Palmer managed to go largely unchallenged throughout the campaign period. I mean, this was a guy who was promising to be all things to all people. Everyone was getting a 20% increase in pensions, indexation of veterans' allowance, 50% tax cut, abolishing the fringe benefits tax.
What voters thought was some common sense, and that's why he got many people's vote. And I mean, if it was a protest vote, what were they protesting against with your side of politics?
Well, look, I couldn't speculate about what they were protesting about. I mean, clearly there is to some extent some dissatisfaction, but I also don't think we should overrate it, Helen. I mean, the reality is that at 15%, there's still 85% of the electorate that was voting against the Palmer Party. And I think what will happen now is, now that we've actually got Palmer people, well, it appears to be, Palmer people in the Parliament, now that they'll actually be subject to a bit of the same scrutiny that the major parties are subjected to, I think we'll start to see the kind of, promises and voodoo economics that underscored the entire Palmer campaign suddenly brought to the forefront, and I think people will see that it's not quite as substantive as they thought it was.
But I mean, in Queensland, the Liberals and the coalition government have seen these sort of attacks from Conservative forces before, and it's all ended in tears really from both points of view, hasn't it? But Steve, I did want to ask you, to what extent was perhaps this swing that we're talking about against you due to reaction against the Campbell-Newman government?
Look, I don't believe for one moment that state factors were an issue. I can tell you honestly, Helen, that nobody raised state issues with me. People very much saw this as a referendum on the carbon tax, cost of living issues. And you know what, Helen, the other key point I'd make too is, for example, in my seat, on a two-party preferred basis, we got a 1% increase in the margin. Likewise, the seat to the south and the seat to the north. So we still saw a trend toward the coalition, and I think that reiterates the fact that for a lot of Queenslanders, there wasn't this so-called pushback from the Campbell government. In fact, we're starting to see some really strong economic numbers coming out of Queensland now, which in many respects reinforces the sterling job that the Campbell-Newman government's been doing.
Michelle Rowland, if you accept that, then this question won't make sense. But I mean, why do you think Kevin Rudd and Labor perhaps wasn't able to capitalise better, more successfully on any anti-Campbell-Newman sentiment, which they were very much trying to push, and win the seats that they thought they'd win, instead of nearly losing some?
Well, from my observations, the anti-Campbell-Newman sentiment sort of peaked a lot earlier in the year, I think.
Right, so you don't think it was a feature at all, so therefore that was a wrong strategy, wasn't it?
Well, look, I didn't study it very closely, to be perfectly frank. Queens, I was pretty much focused on Greenway. From my observations, it seemed to me that it had peaked some months earlier, so it didn't, Steve's closer to it. I don't know whether he agrees with me or not on that, but that's just my observation. But I understand Labor again, please correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know that Labor's actually lost any seats in Queensland.
No, I didn't say it has. But why haven't you been able to, why weren't you able to win the seats that Kevin Rudd said and sort of indicated that we're going to grab a whole lot of seats in Queensland?
May well have been the case that people were actually deciding this on federal issues rather than state issues. So maybe it did indeed, maybe it did indeed not feature as an issue.
Yeah, Michelle Rowland, how much blame do you think Kevin Rudd has to wear in this loss?
Look, I'm not a blame person. I don't allocate blame. Look, I allocate accountability.
Isn't that a way to healing? All right, accountability.
I think
Who
accountability.
do you hold accountable for
well,
this?
Look, Kevin Rudd was the leader of the party when we went into it, and and I think from his speech on Saturday night, I think he accepted full responsibility for it, as every defeated leader should at an election. So
he certainly seemed to be smiling a lot.
Oh, look, I think it was important for him to put on a brave face as well. But yeah, I think every leader takes accountability when they lose. I don't know of any that haven't.
Do you feel you can say, I mean, you've obviously thought about it long before the election and certainly in the last 2 days, where the rot set in?
Oh, look, I think, let's be frank. I mean, the whole time of that I was in there, the leadership was being talked about. At least from the beginning of. At least from the beginning of 2012, obviously, but then I would read a lot in the media.
Do you think it went back
before then?
That?
Well, the thing is, I never really, any journalist can tell them I'm not someone who goes and backgrounds journalists or anything, but I only knew what I was reading in the paper from people saying things are happening here. There's leadership tensions there. I just tuned out by the beginning of 2000. And of course I didn't even vote.
Well, if you tuned out, imagine what voters thought.
Exactly. So it's a lesson. It's a lesson. It's a salient lesson.
Steve Ciobo, free kick for you here. Why do you think Labor had such a decisive loss to your side?
Look, I think the reason that Tony Abbott's Prime Minister today and the reason why the coalition performed well at the election is because we demonstrated a couple of things, Helen. Number one, we demonstrated that we were the adults in the room, a mature party with the experience and the positive plans to take this nation forward. Labor for years was basically burdened with infighting, was burdened with division and dysfunction. And I think the most fundamental error that Labor made, and this was a point that I'd reinforce and I know came back to me from the electorate, is people didn't like the fact that Labor just kept telling porky pies. I mean, they would say one thing and do something else constantly, and at the end of the day, that just erodes public confidence.
Steve, just very quickly, how do you think Tony Abbott will handle this potentially kind of motley crew that might be thrown up by the new Senate after July 1? I mean, admittedly, most of them might be more right-leaning or friendly to the Liberal Party. Do you think it should be easy for Tony Abbott to get support from them on most of his agenda?
Helen, this is going to be a bit of a challenge. There's no doubt about that. I mean, we've got a long way to go. Obviously, we don't even know the final composition, but it would appear that there's going to be a number of micro parties. It's going to come down to good governance. It's going to come down to clear agenda setting with respect to the kinds of policies that we're going to pursue, and let's hope that they listen to the electorate. All
right, Michelle Rowland, who do you want as next Labor leader?
Well, the thing is, I hadn't even turned my mind to anything beyond 6 o'clock on Saturday. So look, I don't even know who's actually thrown their hat in the ring yet, or if anyone actually has. But my understanding from the rules is that Anthony Albanese will be an interim leader, which I think is a great thing. I think Albo is tremendously experienced. He is strategic. He is someone who is very inclusive as well, and I think he'll do a good job in that role. I also, under the new rules that we have, there is an opportunity for rank and file involvement. I hope there is. So I hope there's more than one contender, because I think the party needs to democratise. I would like to see some rank and file involvement in choosing the leader.
All right, Michelle Rowland and Steve Ciobo, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much both for joining us.